everyone, welcome back to What's Next. On today's episode, we have my good friend Sophie, who I know from London. She has a really interesting career path. She is now a lawyer in the States, and so we are going to talk everything law. We are going to talk about law school, law firms, clerkships, etc. She has some great advice for you guys, for whoever's interested in going into the legal profession. And I'm really excited for this one. So yeah, enjoy the show and happy listening. Hello.
Hi.
Welcome to What's Next.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here.
You and I go back a long time.
Yeah, indeed.
We grew up together in England.
Yes, we did.
That is why many people probably say that we sound exactly alike.
Yes, we do sound very, very similar, but that's what happens when you go to an all-girls school
at
the same time.
Exactly. So indeed, we've had a very similar educational experience.
Yes.
Both all-girls schools in England, and then we came over to the States for college and both went to Columbia.
Yes, exactly.
So why don't we start there? So you obviously came over to the States for college. Why did you decide to do that?
So I think it was a number of different things. Firstly, my older brother went to university in the States, and I saw his experience, and I think I just thought that it was more fun than the British experience. US university is kind of all encompassing in the fact that it is, you live on campus, you live in these dorms, you have sports games to go to and shows and extracurriculars and Greek life and take similar classes if you have core curriculums at your schools. And I just kind of thought that that was a really fun environment to be in. But probably the primary motivator for me was the liberal arts education. For your listeners who don't know, in the UK, when you go to university, you just go for one subject. So history or English or mathematics, and you just study that for 3 years. And for me, I was more interested in the liberal arts education in the US, where you have the ability to focus, obviously, through your major on one specific area, but then you also have the opportunity to take classes in a broad array of different subject matters as well. And that I thought was just much more appealing and interesting, and I think also can make you a more well-rounded person and set you up well for the rest of your career.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I feel like I felt the exact same when I was applying to college as well. So then what did you decide to study?
So I ultimately did decide to major in classics, which is Latin and ancient Greek. And that was something I had taken in high school back in the UK quite seriously. And I still really loved it. And so I wanted to take it in the US as well. But exactly as I was saying, if I had been in the UK, I would have just studied Latin and ancient Greek for 3 years. Whereas in the US, I had classics as my major, but then I also had a minor in economics.
Nice.
And as I went to Columbia has the core curriculum. And so that really broadened the types of classes that I was taking inherently. But beyond that, I also chose to touch on a number of different subject matter areas by just taking classes with the extra class space that I had left outside of my major and minor.
What did you want to be when you were in college? And I ask this because classics is an unusual major, and I was also a history major and did not go into something that's like related to history. So what did you want to be, and how did you answer the question that I'm sure you were asked a lot of, why classics and like what's that going to help you?
Yeah, absolutely. So especially in the United States, a number of people look at classics majors, or at least looked at me and said, oh, so you're going to be a professor. Yeah. And that was, I knew I absolutely did not want to do. Yeah. So that was one thing I could cross off the list. But beyond that, I actually had very little idea of what was even out there, let alone what I wanted to do. So that's why I actually think a podcast like this is a really fantastic idea. Because frankly, I just really had no clue what direction I could go in. Yeah. And so I actually took some internships in college, which were a little bit random, one might say, in that I worked in PR my sophomore summer. Wow. And that was really interesting and kind of more creative than I am as a person. So really fun, but not something that was particularly necessarily well suited to me. But it was a good experience in the sense that I just was able to try an area which I knew absolutely nothing about.
Yeah.
And that's why internships are so valuable, is because it is that chance you have to just try completely different areas of work which you don't know anything about and won't know anything about until you are actually there.
Absolutely.
And experiencing it. Because it's not like, at least at Columbia, they don't have PR classes or anything like that. So it's really good to be able to have that kind of experience if you have the opportunity.
Yeah.
But after that summer, I realized that I was not a creative and it was not going to work out for me. And then with my econ minor and with being at Columbia, a lot of people go into finance.
Yeah.
And so I think I gravitated towards finance more as this is something which I can get a lot of information about from my peers and people who are more senior to me at school, and also a route which is quite well trodden. So it was kind of a bit of a straightforward choice. I didn't necessarily know whether it was something that I really would love or be interested in, but I knew that it was a great career and intellectually challenging, monetarily rewarding, and also something I would probably be able to get.
Yeah.
And so that's how I ended up interning in private banking my junior summer. And from that, I decided that I was going to, as a senior, apply for different firms, but still within the private banking space.
So you graduate and you get this job as a rotational analyst. Did you like that job? When was it that you decided that you no longer wanted to be on the finance path and wanted to try law?
Firstly, it was a rotational analyst program. And so over the course of 2 years, I went through 4 sectors of the private bank. That was really cool because that meant that I got to touch on very different areas than but it meant that it was a really interesting experience because for only 6 months, which if you think about it is a really short amount of time, you get to kind of experience this group and learn a tremendous amount. And then you move on to something new.
Yeah.
So I actually think that it was a really fantastic program, and I highly recommend rotational analyst programs because I just think they're a really great way to get a more fundamental understanding of how a particular area of a bank or a financial institution as a whole works. And so if you can find those kinds of programs, I really highly recommend them. But it did happen that over the course of my time there, I realized that it wasn't necessarily for me. And so what happened was, I think that I thought that it was interesting work. I liked the 4 groups that I spent my time in, but I didn't see any particular area as one which I would really just want to spend kind of the rest of my career doing, or even a significant portion of my career doing. And so that made me kind of think about what are the type of skills I have and I enjoy utilizing. And so that actually made me look back towards my time during college and realize that what I really loved was the classics. And I think a big component of that is the kind of logic behind the languages and the analytical skills that you need to utilize, and just the kind of research and writing that is required to be able to excel in that major. So that's what really led me to think that maybe the law might be a good area to consider. And I had toyed with the idea of being a lawyer earlier in my life, at the beginning of college, and also I think maybe in middle school time even. But I think I always frankly thought that I wouldn't necessarily be smart enough for it. I think that that's really a warning to anyone out there listening to this, that don't write yourself off from a particular area because of your own insecurities or self-doubt. If you think that it would be interesting for you, then I think you should go after it, or at least do a lot more research before writing it off.
Yeah. What did you think that it was about the law and about being a lawyer that required to have this high level of intelligence that you do have, but that you thought you didn't?
Yeah, well, I think that, so I have many extremely bright friends, but one extremely bright friend who I've been friends with since freshman year. And she very much wanted to be a lawyer. And she was very fixated on basically getting perfect grades at undergrad.
Yeah.
Because she wanted to go to the best law school and all of this. And I was speaking to her about it, and I was like, well, I don't have the best grades. I had come in as a freshman, quite like overwhelmed by the GPA process in the US. It's very different from how school works in the UK.
Yeah.
And so I was speaking with her, and I was like, oh, well, you know what? Like, I'm just not going to be able to get into a good law school. So I guess that's that. And this was after, I think, freshman fall.
Oh my gosh, and you wrote it off then.
And I already had basically given up, and I just was like, oh, I'm not as smart as her, and so I think I should try something else. And I don't think I had thought about it so seriously that it was like my dreams were dashed.
Yeah.
But it kind of put a little bit of a halt on any further investigation into that path, exactly, because of this self-doubt.
A lesson to be learned.
A lesson to be learned to the listeners, absolutely.
So you're in the private bank, and you're realizing that this might not be your path. What was the first thing you did when you realized you might want to go down this path towards being a lawyer?
So the first thing I did is talk to a lot of people. I talked to already practicing lawyers, but also a number of people in law school and also people who were applying for law school. And I think that is just a really, really vital thing to do. I'm sure you've talked about this with many of your other people who you've interviewed, but informational interviews are just so important. And that's why, again, this podcast is so great, because essentially it's a lot of informational interviews.
A little subtle shout out in the
subtle plug for the pod. But I really do just think it's extraordinarily valuable to be able to talk to people and just get a whole array of different insights, because people will have different views and people have taken different paths, and everything that they have to say is valuable, and you can just take all of this information and kind of winnow it into what's a good path for me, and what makes sense for me. And so I spoke to a ton of people, and obviously, again, this is with any job or any line of work. You never know if you're going to like it until you get there, unfortunately. Yeah. So that's why talking to people is important. But at the end of the day, it's not until you sit your butt in the seat and actually start working that you know whether it's something you like or not. And so I figured that it probably would be. And that's when I started studying for the LSAT.
How did you manage that with... Obviously, you were still working full time. Yeah. And you now had to study for this massive exam, something that's kind of unusual. What were the resources you used? How did you manage that?
Yeah. So I was fortunate enough to have the resources to be able to buy a course. And I would actually say, especially if you're working full time, that's just such a valuable thing to do. They're kind of pricey, unfortunately, but they're really great in that, one, they just sit your butt down on a seat and force you to study. I think it was a couple times a week, and then you had homework. And I just think that's so valuable, because when you're busy and you're working and you're tired at the end of the day, the last thing you want to do is by yourself in your house, open up a textbook. And so if you're in a classroom with a number of people and they're all doing it together, it's more of a kind of a collegial environment of getting through this pain together. It was a really, really great course also because it gave a lot of tips and tricks for doing the LSAT. The LSAT is one of those exams which is kind of... there's ways to kind of trick into just figuring it out. Sorry, that wasn't very eloquent. No, it's perfect. There's many different kind of techniques which can help you improve your score, and seeing as every single point counts once you get into the high numbers. Just even having one trick up your sleeve can make a really big difference in your score. And so I thought the course gave me a number of those tricks which I wouldn't have been able to come up with myself. And you can't just glean from straight studying.
Yeah.
And so those were helpful as well.
Yeah.
So grueled through that.
And managed to get it done.
But also the other thing which I would say about law school, which is quite unique, is that you can actually get quite a good sense of where you're going to get in based off your LSAT score and GPA. And so the schools publish, I think their average certainly, but also maybe probably not their high and low, just their averages. But if you look at their averages and you look at your scores, then you can get a pretty good sense of if you're going to be able to get into there or not. And so that means that your applications can be a bit more targeted than they are during undergrad when there's a whole confluence of other factors which come into play.
Absolutely. So you ultimately ended up at Columbia.
I was
back at Columbia. Why did you decide to go back to Columbia?
Candidly, it was the best school that I got into. And also on top of that, I love New York. Yes. A big New Yorker. And I knew I wanted to spend my career in New York. And I do think that that's an important thing for law school, which is certainly less important for undergrad. But law firms tend to recruit from schools in their area. Mm-hmm. And so a very large percentage of the major law firms here in New York hire from schools in New York. And so it means that if, for instance, you are desperate to practice in California, it might make more sense to go to a California law school. And likewise, if you really want to practice in Chicago, it might make sense to go to Chicago.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. So you arrive back at Columbia and you're back there for law school, and we can have you back on another day to go into more detail about your law school experience. But what was it like? What was your day to day? Did it feel different from undergrad? Did it feel the same?
Yeah, sure. And I have a whole host of things to talk about law school. It's quite the intricate and intense environment. So yes, definitely happy to do another pod on that. But I would say it is quite different from undergrad. And I think that sometimes people who go straight through from undergrad to law school tend to struggle a little bit more because they are expecting a bit more of an undergraduate environment. Whereas in fact, law school is a little bit more like a job.
Yeah.
And so I loved being back because I loved being in school. And so I was so excited to get my Columbia Law School backpack and just all the swag and sit in a classroom and listen to a professor who's infinitely more intelligent than anyone in the room. And just learn. But the thing is that especially at law school, the first year is hard work.
Yeah.
The curve is unbelievably hard. Everyone there is extraordinarily smart and very ambitious. And so it means that from the get-go, you are working just as hard, if not harder, than the jobs that you had before you came to law school. And I loved being there and being back in a learning environment, as I said, but also very swiftly I recognized that my bum was now in the seat and I really did love the place that I had ended up. And I was very grateful to be a lawyer.
Indeed, we'll have to have you back to discuss all of that in more details. I'm sure lots of people would like to know what law school is like in the specifics. So you go through, it's 3 years. What's the process of you getting your job?
The hiring process depends on what kind of area of the law you want to go into. So for instance, if you're interested in being a public defender after graduating, that hiring process is totally different from the law firm hiring process. If you want to go into some other area of the government, again, public interest generally has quite a different path. But the majority of people in law school, at least at Columbia Law School, end up at big law firms, either here in the city or elsewhere around the country. And that hiring process, this is one of the reasons that the first year is extremely tough, is because those major law firms hire for their summer internships after your second year, before your second year begins. So basically they are hiring based off 1 year of grades. And so there's not very much to look at. And so that's why people are really angling quite hard to get great grades that first year, because they have to try and distinguish themselves.
Absolutely.
And that's quite difficult to do when the curve is so strict. And so you go through this process of, it's called OCI or EIP, whatever each of the schools call it. But it's basically a little bit like speed dating with a number of different law firms. And so the law firms will essentially come to what was, in my time, a hotel in Times Square. I think now it's done mostly over Zoom post-pandemic. But it'll be 20-minute interviews with all of these different law firms over a course of 3 days. And you'll just be bumping from interview to interview and chatting with different people. And then from there, they'll offer to give you a call back at their law firm for a full day of recruiting at the law firm. And then from there, you get an offer to be a summer associate.
Oh, got it.
As a second year. So after your second year, you will go to that law firm which you have chosen, and you'll be a summer associate at that law firm, and you'll do some work and you'll do lots of play.
Oh, great.
And then at the end of the summer, for the most part, most people get hired to come back full time. Of course, if you didn't enjoy your summer, then you can recruit again to go to a different law firm.
Yeah.
But most people tend to stick with their law firms, which they went to the summer with, because it's frankly a lot easier. And usually you're quite well taken care of as a summer associate. So you're happy to go back full time.
You did finally wind up at a law firm. What does that look like? I can't even begin to imagine, from the outside. Sure, everyone hears of big law firms. We have suits. Everyone thinks it looks like suits. Does it look like suits? Is it suits? Please tell the world now.
It is not suits.
Oh, sad.
So for anyone who comes to me saying that they want to be a lawyer because of suits, I'm like, don't do it. But yes, so essentially, one of the easiest ways to kind of, in very basic terms, break down big law firms is that they're usually divided into corporate and litigation. Litigation, very high level, and I can go into it in more detail, but it's what you traditionally think of as a lawyer. It's going in front of a judge, it's making very eloquent arguments, and essentially arguing cases. On the other side is corporate, and that's business transactions, essentially. So mergers and acquisitions, capital markets, finance. The lawyers are there helping those deals go along by essentially doing the paperwork and making sure that everything is legal and everything is as their client wants it to be before executing on a deal. So those are the two broad categories. And usually by the end of law school, you'll have decided whether you want to go into one or the other.
Got it.
And you'll go into your law firm into one of those two groups. Then depending on the law firm, there's many different possibilities. Some law firms have you rotate amongst different groups, for instance, on the corporate side. Some have you specialize in a very specific area like bankruptcy. Some have you, on the litigation side, you can be a generalist and work on absolutely everything and take any cases that come in at any particular time, while others say, oh, you should specialize as an IP lawyer. And so there's a lot of variation within that, and that's a big part of the process of when you are interviewing for these law firms, is trying to distinguish what would be best for me in terms of what I want. Because some people might be like, I am a M&A corporate attorney and I am just doing that. And so you should go to a law firm which is, one, really good at that, and two, allows you to just focus on that and just do that all the way through. And then other people might be like, I have no idea what I want to do. I don't know if I want to be corporate or litigation. Like, I certainly don't know what I would want to be within that. And so I need more flexibility and the ability to try different things. And so then you might gravitate towards law firms that give you that kind of experience, either over the summer or even further on once you've started.
So what did you choose?
So I went down an interesting route. I was one of the ones who really was very undecided. I didn't know if I wanted to do corporate or litigation during my 1L year. And so I chose a firm that was really good at both of them. And then over my summer, I took a ton of different corporate assignments because basically I was like, it's much easier if you want to eventually go to a different country to do so from the corporate side rather than the litigation side. And so I thought that maybe I might want to go back to the UK at some point. And so I was like, let me try everything in corporate.
Yeah.
And if I don't like it, I'm pretty sure I would like litigation. So I'm going to try all of the different things on the corporate side. And frankly, I didn't like most of the things on the corporate side. But there was this one group that I did like, the banking group, which was more of a regulatory advisory group. And essentially it worked with financial institutions in order to advise them on how they can go about their business within the confines of specific laws. And it required writing extensive memos, doing a lot of research on both federal and state banking laws. The financial services industry is a highly regulated industry. So it just means that there's a lot for these financial institutions to navigate.
Yeah.
And so even beyond executing on deals, they just needed to be able to know like how to do, certainly deals are a component, but how to even like run their compliance programs, things like that. So that was a group which I quite enjoyed over my summer. And so when I went back full time, I joined that group for a year.
Do you think your time in private banking had an influence on you liking that?
Yeah, maybe, because I think that I had a bit of an understanding of the financial services space already. But there's so many aspects of financial services. And so, for instance, the capital markets group, of course, is like dealing very closely with financial services. And that was not really for me.
Interesting.
And so I think I was more, again, I was leaning towards this research and writing
Got it.
aspect. But I didn't want to kind of fully commit myself to litigation and staying in the US for the rest of time.
I mean, that's a big choice. Understandable.
Yeah. So I did that for a year. And then I actually did decide to move over to the litigation side. And my firm was very flexible in allowing me to do that. So I was quite lucky. And so then I worked in litigation for a year, and I did mostly white collar work, which essentially is government going after people for breaking laws, usually financial institutions. So if you think about the Securities and Exchange Commission, the OCC, or the Department of Justice themselves, they were like main players in going after these financial institutions for any kind of nefarious deeds that they had done. And then we would be on the other side defending them. Don't get me wrong, it isn't always financial institutions. It's just often it can be financial institutions. And that was the work that I had done coming from the banking group. And so I slipped into the white collar side doing mostly financial institution defense there.
What are the hours for a lawyer and at these big law firms? I think if you are deciding to go down this path, I think that's something that's important to understand. Like from Suits, it looks like you're working till late in the night.
Yeah, I guess Suits is accurate in that way, but I certainly don't wake up as stunning as Meghan Markle the next day. So
crazy. You have the makeup team behind you.
shocking that. But so the hours at law firms can be extremely tough. They aren't paying you good money for no reason.
Yeah.
And there is a bit of an expectation that you should always be on. That means that whether it's late at night or over the weekends, there is a bit of that expectation. Not that you will be on, but like if you need to be, you will have to.
Yeah.
So it can be extremely tough.
Yeah. How do you live your life with that?
Right. So it is a little bit of learning. And once you've been there for a while, you start to get more of a sense of when exactly you can take time. Also, again, depends on the group. For instance, M&A is quite cyclical. And so, well, not cyclical, but you'll have periods where it's extraordinarily busy because you're going through a deal. And then you'll have periods where you're doing absolutely nothing at all.
Yeah.
And so then you're quite free and you learn to very much utilize that time. Other groups, litigation, for instance, is quite steady. It's like usually quite steadily busy. But then around the time close to filing papers with the court or, of course, trial, it's going to be extraordinarily busy. And so then you just kind of have to block out that time and just know that you won't really have a life.
Yeah.
But once it's done, then you will have more space to do more things. I do think there's also an aspect of When you're junior, you kind of are a bit more expected to take things on at any time. And so as you get more senior, you can have a little bit more control over your schedule.
Absolutely.
And also when you're junior, you're just learning things. A lot of the time that can take up a lot of your time and energy. And so you're not doing things as quickly as you might be able to do in a few years.
Mm-hmm.
And then the final thing is you just have to kind of set your own boundaries. If it does become really excessive, then you do need to speak to someone and be like, it's too much.
Do you think New York is worse than other cities?
Yes, definitely. I definitely think that New York is worse. I think DC is a little bit comparable, but otherwise other places are much better.
As a product of the nature of New York City, or as a product of these are where most of these firms are and headquartered, and most of the business is just simply here?
Yeah, I think that it's a little bit of a combination of both. Obviously, there's a lot of work in New York, but also I think the personalities, it doesn't help the investment bankers are quite intense as well, for instance.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so the personalities of New York, and even that's to like stereotype. I mean, people in any industry, people in entertainment, they're all really grinding. There's a little bit of just kind of the culture of New York being an aspect of it. But then also, there's a lot of business in New York, and a lot of the business and the clients have high expectations. But I think that lawyers tend to work extraordinarily hard. But I certainly think that if you're willing to work really hard and you want to work hard, you can make it work as well.
You left your law firm to start a clerkship. Why don't you start by explaining what a clerkship is for those who probably don't know?
Yes. So a clerkship is something that it's essentially a year of working for a judge, either a state court judge or a federal court judge. And it's usually 1 year, but sometimes judges will have, not very frequently, but sometimes they'll have them for 2, but also people sometimes stack them. So you can work for a district court judge, which is the trial court judge. You can then clerk for a appellate court judge, which is when a trial court decision gets appealed to a higher level. That's the appellate level. And you can clerk for a judge at that level as well. And then, of course, if you're extremely smart, you can work for the Supreme Court.
Wow.
This is at the federal level. And then the equivalent at the state, you could also do all 3 if you wanted to. So I clerked for a district court judge here in New York, at the Southern District of New York. And I got that a year after I graduated from law school. It's becoming increasingly common that people will work for a few years before they do a clerkship.
Got it.
It's not always the case, but it's becoming more common.
Yeah.
And so I worked for 2 years and then started my clerkship.
Got it. What does it take to apply for a clerkship? And why did you want to do it?
Yeah. So a lot of people apply actually during law school. There's something called the plan. So people who are in law school will learn about this for sure. But there's a specific period when second years can start to apply for clerkships. And essentially, it doesn't actually require a tremendous amount. It requires a couple of writing samples. It requires your resume, of course, a very quick cover letter. And then it requires letters of recommendation.
Okay.
And those are extremely important because these are basically big shot professors going to bat for you.
Yeah.
You can often have these professors write recommendations, and then also sometimes they'll make calls on your behalf if they know a particular judge who they think you'd be suited for.
Oh, wow.
And so the professor recommendation is really, I think, the most important component. And so you can apply through, there's a portal, and you can apply for hundreds of judges. You can apply all around the country for as many as you want.
Wow.
But then usually if you get an interview and they give you an offer, then you have to accept. So if you get an offer from someone in Kansas, perhaps, then you should go to Kansas. It's usually the protocol.
Do you ever get more than one clerkship, or is it just like first comes, first serve, and whichever one you get offered first, you have to take?
Yeah, that's usually how it works.
Oh, wow.
First come, first serve, and then you have to take it, and then you have to pull your other applications.
Oh, wow.
But you could decline it and hope for another, but these are quite difficult to get.
Absolutely.
And so it's a bit of a risk. So you can either apply after your 2L year on plan, which is how it's called when the floodgates open up, or you can apply at any point subsequent to that. And so that's why I waited for a little bit. After my 3rd year, I applied. I felt like I had stronger recommendations, and also I hadn't quite decided if I wanted to until after I graduated. But then at that point, I decided it would be very valuable, and so I put my application in. and I was fortunate enough to get.
We're almost ready to wrap up. But as you know, this is obviously a podcast for people who are interested in these fields. So we can't let you go without getting some advice. I'm going to ask you advice from like certain stages of your career so far. So what is the biggest piece of advice you have for applying to law school?
Applying to law school. So I think that we kind of touched on this. Firstly, I would make sure you're very certain you want to go to law school.
Yeah.
Law school is an extremely tough experience, and being a lawyer is kind of tougher after that.
Yeah.
And obviously you can always choose not to be a lawyer, but then you've spent all this money. So
Yeah.
I would advise just being really sure that you want to go to law school. And as I had mentioned earlier, just talking to as many people as possible is a great way to do that.
Yeah.
Secondly, if you can, I would very much recommend taking an LSAT course. The LSAT is going to be a primary driver of where you get in. And so don't underestimate how much time you should spend on that.
Great.
Yeah.
So then what's your biggest piece of advice for the law firm life?
Oh, that's tough. I think that it is obviously you want to be performing your best and you want to be handing in highest quality work, build good relationships with the people around you, especially the partners. They are brilliant and they will help you for whatever you want to go to next in your career. Make some great friends over the summer if you can, because they certainly have helped me through my time at big law firms. And then just do try and have some kind of a life as well.
Yeah.
It's important to do things outside of the office. Even though sometimes you can be knee deep in what's there.
Give your brain a break. And finally, biggest piece of advice for a clerkship, if you want to go down that route.
Yeah, so if you want to go down that route again, I would really recommend talking to people who have done clerkships because one, you can learn about different judges and different experiences. But secondly, you never know who might kind of slip a note to their judge and say, this person's really great, you should consider them. So talk to people who have clerked, are clerking, are going to clerk. And then also, exactly, if you can get great professor recommendations, build good relationships with professors.
Yeah.
Like those recommendations should be authentic rather than just repetitions of what they've written for other students before. Yeah. And on top of that, like if they like you enough, they might be willing to make a call. So
finally, we can't end without asking, what's next?
What's next? So I am finished with my clerkship.
Congrats.
Thank you. And I'm going to be taking some time.
Amazing.
Because...
well deserved.
Exactly. I deserve it. And then I'm going to be starting at a new, smaller law firm, a boutique law firm in the new year.
Doing similar things that you were doing before or different?
I will be focusing on litigation. So I finally
decided,
after all this time, decided where I'm going.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much, Sophie, for coming on the podcast. We really appreciate it. We will definitely have to have you back to get into more of the nitty-gritty about the lawyer life. But thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. So happy to be here.